Welcome to Trulyfit.
Dr. Blair Steel, thank you so much for joining the Trulyfit Podcast for the second time. For the people who have not heard you on the first round, why don't you give us a little background on your credentials and then what you do day to day in the health space?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I work both in private practice and in treatment centers. So I've written curriculum for centers. I provide clinical supervision for the current practitioners there. And I've since been jumping on the podcast circuit and writing articles, and I'm really interested in this very fun way of spreading information around.
Yeah, and you were just speaking at South by Southwest, where I got a chance to come down and see you after the fact, being that I'm so close in Austin.
So great to see you in person.
And part of what you do is addiction-related therapy, and counseling, for lack of a better term. We're not going to be talking about that today. I just did a podcast with Dr. Chris Swart on addiction recovery, which was,
I saw that.
Yeah, which is really interesting and intriguing. It's the second podcast I did concerning addiction, and a lot of the conversation ends up being, because I only have so many avenues in which I can see it through my lens. It's like, why don't, in the addiction space, like, why don't they focus more on the bio side, like getting people healthier from the nutrition side, right? From the physical side and exercise. Do you have any insights on that? Have you ever thought about that? Is that something that you talk about with your clients?
I have. I was recently on a panel with nutritionists, and the fact of the matter is, if someone's operating from their limbic system, from their emotional brain, which is characteristic of active addiction, the tools, the planning, the ability to have that executive functioning that is, I think, essential for the workout routines and the diet and all of that is kind of offline, right? So you'll have people that have an amazing wellness plan, workout plan, nutrition plan. However, if they're not operating from a place, like if the compulsive behaviors are there, it's going to come down to that and needing to treat the behaviors. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. Yeah, I gave a description a little bit more crude with less science behind it, but an analogy. If I'm on 4 hours of sleep and I wake up in the morning and my child dumps her cereal on the ground, I'm way more likely to snap than if I have been eating properly and exercising and I got 8 or 9 hours of sleep. Then I can compose myself and do the right thing, right? So I think you want to be optimized in all of the other areas physiologically so that psychologically you can make the right decisions.
That's right. That's right. And I think health and wellness and nutrition is so important. It really, truly is. It's kind of on the back burner for days, like say 0 to 30 in the treatment center or treating someone with addiction, right? We need to rewire the reward system. So we're getting dopamine and serotonin and endorphins and those good releases from the things that you would coach people with fitness and in the gym when they're still really raw and their neural pathways have been using substances to get that. Their brain really thinks they need that to survive. And it's hard to redirect that behavior if it's too early in the game.
Sure. Well, that won't be the lion's share of our conversation today. Parenting and mental health and everything to do with parenting. I love it. We are both parents. We talk a lot about our kids. That's what parents do.
Yep.
Do you think there is a blueprint for like the perfect parent, for a great parent? Or would you say there can't possibly be one given the biodiversity and psychodiversity of all of humans?
There could not be. And let's have the goal be good enough parent. Truly, we can't, if we are approaching this with perfectionism and with like, this is what the book says, and this is, what I believe to be true, and with an intensity that doesn't allow for things to happen, it might create like a whole different environment in your home. And now we have a parent operating in shame because they're human beings, are not really able to be perfect in every arena. That doesn't sound effective to me, right?
No,
good
not
enough.
at all.
Like, even when you think about, like, if studies will show you from the old days that the ideal recipe of parenting is a good amount of warmth with a good amount of structure. So if your goal is to get like a solid B in both of those things, that's fantastic, right? all the warmth without structure is going to create issues. All the structure without the warmth will create issues.
Not to mention the kids are going to be so much different. You could have a parent who parents the same exact way to kid A and kid B, and that's actually a mistake because kid B needed a different type of parenting, right? So they
Right.
were the quote unquote perfect parent for kid A, but then they messed
Yep.
up or they didn't do the proper things because kid B maybe needed a little bit more structure than kid A did.
That's such a good point. Like these people, we have to give our children permission to be different from us and from one another
Yeah.
as well. So exactly what you're saying, if we have the blueprint and we're inflexible and we think it's this one size fits all model, we could really lose the connection with our children. And I feel like at the most primal level, that's really what we need more than anything.
Agreed.
I just learned this week. I want to give credit. I want to say it was the Theo Von podcast with Tim Fletcher about complex trauma. I think that's where that came from. But he wanted to note that functional versus dysfunctional families. I think it's commonly thought that like the functional family has like no conflict whatsoever or very minimal. And that's not it. A functional family is one that has the problems, but also has the repair. And that models how to cope and regulate with the conflict, right? So it's not a conflict avoidant. It's functioning because it models repair.
Makes perfect sense. It's a lie to say that my family or any family dynamic doesn't have problems. It's the families who appear they don't have problems. It's usually repressed. They don't talk about it. And there's like conversations that can't be had between mother and daughter or father and son or vice versa. And then they just keep kicking the can down the road and they never get to that point where, they can spend a lot of time together, let's say, right? Maybe that's just they visit for 2 hours and then they're gone because they can't spend a whole day together because they have some deep internal conflict that they never want to bring up.
Right. That's right.
In Jonathan Haidt's newest book, it's called The Anxious Generation. He looks at a lot of problems around parenting and children and smartphones. He basically says we have been rewired due to these smartphones. He matches the level of anxiety and depression and even suicide rates basically to the same exact time that we got the smartphone and that social media came about. But the very interesting thing I saw is that when he polled these young kids in the 15-year-old range, and he asked them, would you give up your favorite food if all your friends did? And they said no, because they find value in their food, whatever that is, the pizza. Like, I don't care if my friends aren't eating pizza. I love pizza. But then he said, would you give up the smartphone if all your friends did? And majority of them said yes. And it's because they don't find value in the smartphone. They want to use it because the fear of missing out. Everyone else has the smartphone and I don't have the smartphone. Do you see that there is an issue in electronics in maybe younger patients, or have you read anything about this in your industry?
There are.
And then how would you deal with it personally, anecdotally, as a parent?
Yeah, there really are, as particularly around girls between the ages of like 12 and 16, I want to say, but it hits both genders, all genders, let's say, and it's certainly it's a thing, and particularly with the young brain. I really feel like we need, as parents and as just adults in the community, educators, to hold boundaries and limitations during that stage, right? So perhaps I think it was this man that I saw in Bill Maher actually, because all the information sounded really familiar, who was saying like, sure, perhaps your 14, 15-year-old, 13-year-old is in a sport and you want them to have a phone, they can call you, so you could pick them up, you want to have their location, things like that. You can really achieve that with like a burner phone. Like it doesn't have to be a smartphone.
Yeah.
So I think the pushback that you'll get from parents, like they might see this information and be like, okay, this is problematic, but I feel more safe and my child is more safe when we know exactly where each other are at all times.
Sure.
So achieve that with kind of maybe a flip phone or whatever, but the real young ones on social media is creating a complex web of interrelated issues that I don't want to say is irreversible, but it really is alarming, from the reward system, from immediate gratification, from from identity, shame. We see a rise in eating disorders, a rise in suicidality and anxiety, and really severe mental health consequences that are undeniably linked to the smartphone. The timeline is there. And now we have all the information because they've been around long enough for us to
Mhm.
really analyze it. So it's like undeniable.
Yeah, there's
It's
some
scary.
states, I think it might be Florida, who's trying to outlaw like specific things that these social media platforms do. So for one, like algorithmically, obviously targeting kids and showing them things
Right.
that maybe they shouldn't be seeing. The other is the fact that the videos and audio pop up automatically without even clicking on it. That was not how
Yep.
it used to be, right? When back in our day, Facebook literally came out the first year we were in college, right? Back in like
Right.
2003. Like there were no videos, but when videos did come about, you have to click on play. Not anymore. You scroll,
Right.
that video's playing already. And
That's
so
right.
so getting some of these things away to make it less addictive and interactive in a bad way is important. And then I would also say if your kid has to have a smartphone, you could have one family phone that everyone
Sure.
uses, right? When the kid goes on that trip to the sports game 3 hours away, he's
Hmm.
traveling from wherever, LA to Santa Barbara. It's like, okay, well, give the kid the phone, but it's the family phone. When he comes home, he gives it back. And so you know what's going on that phone. He doesn't always have it, he or she.
Right. Right. It is this weird feeling of being pried upon uh lately. I mean, even when my oldest daughter, who's almost 6, was around like 2.5 or so, we were YouTubing Sesame Street videos, and before you knew it, like the algorithm knew there was a toddler in my house and we
Yeah.
were getting fed things. And initially it was like, oh, this is kind of nice. And then it was not too much longer that it felt really icky. um and that we were being fed content, and I had to have a YouTube free house because that stuff, it just keeps going. And it really does not feel appropriate.
Yeah, but it's what's happening. So that's how these
Yep.
platforms make money. It's not like a conspiracy theory. The reason why
Right.
Instagram is free and Facebook is free and all of these things are free, the reason why Planet Fitness charges you $10 a month is because they're able to then monetize your data and sell it off
Right.
other places. Because when you sign no one's reading the fine print anymore when they're signing away all this information. And that's where the
Right.
money really comes in because then advertisers can target you. And in some ways, it's not terrible because a lot of times I'm targeted things that I really want. It's like, oh, here's this
Hmm.
cool new like golf gadget that you really want. It's like, great.
Sure.
But
As an adult man.
as an adult, exactly. That's the thing, right? It's way different if you're a 14-year-old girl and someone's
Hmm.
targeting you with things that might emotionally affect you long term.
Right. Right. I think they really need us. I think they really need our help. The younger ones with everything. It is not across the board, right? Like they're not expected to have boundaries or self-awareness or the ability to play out the tape and look at consequences. I mean, their brains aren't even developed to that point. And this, I feel like, has to get on that list of like really serious things that require our help.
Yeah. And I
To
think
not demonize the thing, it's to require our attention.
Yeah, and it didn't work in the last generation, and I hope that our generation picks it up, right? Our generation
Same.
sees what it's going to do, and to no fault of the generation beforehand, I don't. Again, this stuff came out in the early 2000s. I don't think we really understood what it was going to do, psychologically to teens and to young people, and we
Right.
couldn't have foreseen that.
And it's just gotten smarter and smarter and smarter as well. It's been evolving. So what it is today wasn't what it was when it began. So it was like a light, digestible thing, and it's become definitely more than that.
There's a term called helicopter parenting. It started in the 90s. It's also
Hmm.
sometimes referred to as conservative cultivating parenting. People started making more money and having fewer kids, so they were more involved in their kids' activities. It's like,
Hmm.
I'm going to bring Blair to, piano, and then she's going to go to this maybe specialized math course, and then we're going to go to here and there. I think, people thought that was going to be a problem, this sort of like over supervising kind of
Hmm.
generation, but I don't necessarily know if that was a big problem. Is that still an issue? I mean, I feel like that was our generation, and I don't see that many problems coming out of our generation from that.
I honestly haven't either. I really haven't. I haven't seen, I would say, so if I could assume um what the fear would have been, my guess is that what we would do is kind of cut our children off at the knees when it comes to developing their own skills, right? So
Sure.
if we do everything for them, they're kind of like, the fear would be they'd compensate and would be kind of helpless and at a loss if it wasn't for the parents to jump in. And I'm with you. I haven't seen that. I have not seen that at all, actually.
Yeah, and it makes sense, like you said, from a psychological perspective. If we're hand holding the child, so to speak. But I think it was less of that in our generation. It wasn't hand holding. It was just expectations. Like, I want you to do great things. So I'm going to get you involved in maybe things that were, if our parents were growing up lower class, they wanted us to be
Mhm.
more middle class, more middle to upper
Mhm.
class. So they wanted us to be in activities which they considered middle to upper class activities.
Right. Right. And one would just hope that, the child would be considered as the events are being picked in the extracurriculars, and do they like it? Do they not like it? Right. We would just hope that, is the child tired? Maybe it's after school and you've got two back-to-back, activities. Maybe that's too much. So you would just hope that people are taking a beat to see if the child is interested in it.
Yeah. Not easy being a parent in
It's
2024.
not. Oh my goodness. And I read a parenting book, which I really don't love parenting books in general. I think they could be shame inducing. I think it could be back to that like perfectionistic thing, right? If we are overly informed and trying so hard to do these guidelines and all of it, it feels like we can really miss what's happening right in front of us.
Yeah.
Um, that being said, I read Dr. Becky's Good Inside. Have you heard of Dr. Becky?
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it. No.
Okay, hats off to her. And she even speaks about how most parenting books, like she's not even into parenting books for the most part, but she really touched upon something with like prioritizing connection over correction and really getting the results when it comes to your children and you operating gracefully with one another. So I recommend that one. But in general, for the record, I think parenting books suck.
Well, let's stay on that topic, because maybe I'm just
Yeah, let's do it.
very sensitive to this, but I'm almost offended by parenting advice.
Okay.
I find parenting to be sort of a culmination of all of the things that I've learned, my crystallized knowledge and intelligence over time, all of the things that I've
Mhm.
ever learned and put into this box in my brain, and saying, like, I'm going to treat my child the way that I think is going to best suit them. And when I get advice, sometimes for better or for worse, I feel like, what do you know about me and my children and how I'm going to raise
Right.
this? And am I being too sensitive about this? Or do you feel like most parents feel that way?
I feel like most parents feel that way. It's
Mm.
particularly if it's unsolicited. And also, it's can come off as really judgy and make us feel like shit.
Yeah.
So, I that doesn't seem off base at all. It really doesn't. I mean, even just to think of what are the big camps, sleep, co-sleeping versus sleep training or whatever, all these major things. And I think we could assume that most families are going to do what works best for them.
Yeah. Also, it's a weird, I look at things of like results based driven. So let's go ahead and say, this is a crude analogy, but if you're like a mechanic and you're fixing cars, and you fix like a 3,000 whatever transmissions before, and what's wrong with my transmission. You're like, hey, Steve, you just need like an extra bolt here in this transmission. I fixed
Mhm.
3,000 of these. But if you're a parent and your kids are like 2 and 4, and you don't even like, you don't know how your techniques have even panned out yet, because
Mhm.
they haven't grown, they haven't done anything yet. So for all you know, all of your techniques are wrong, actually. So that
Right.
that I think that sort of is why I feel a little bit sensitive about it, because I feel like a lot of parents
Yeah.
try to tell people what to do, and it's like, well, you're so early on in this. How do you really know that any of this has worked?
Correct. Not to mention, you get into a rhythm with your kid and then they change.
Mm, touche.
So
Yeah.
if we're rigid around our approach, that could it's important to evolve, right? With what's happening. And you're right. Who's to say? And then throw in the variations of personality amongst kids. Like I have one really deeply feeling sensitive child and one who's less so. So the way that I speak to and interact with one is not gonna translate with my younger one.
Yeah. Yeah, that
So
makes
there's
sense.
no, it's hard to really generalize. It's so much to consider.
Yeah, that's a big puzzle. I don't think we'll ever totally figure it out. We just have to do our
Right.
best.
And you know what? And I love, like one thing I'll say to a struggling parent is like the fact that you're really interested in information shows that you are a good enough parent.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Isn't it? And just like almost by default, it's like it already checks some boxes of interest and care and willingness and curiosity. So that alone, like you can like hang your hat on that.
From a clinical standpoint, do you involve the parents in, let's say, if you're dealing with a child who has depression or anxiety or addiction or anything? I know
Mm,
these are all, very different things, but in any of
yeah.
these cases, do you also involve the parent? You bring the parent in to speak with it, or is that not normal in the clinical world?
I always involve
Yeah,
the parents, particularly in treatment, but I'm dealing with adult children. So adults.
sure.
I don't work with children
Yeah,
for reasons that like are just so personal to me. I really operate clinically from a place of empowerment. I really believe that adults have the ability to, even if they were at one point victims, to work through that and have control over their environments and make changes. I can't employ those ideas to a child. They really don't have control over their environments, and I fear that I would be a mess. I feel like my boundaries aren't as good with kids because I would probably really want to come in and rescue them maybe, and that's not healthy.
yeah. But what about like a 16 or 17-year-old?
So the youngest person I'll see is 18. That's
Gotcha.
like as young as it goes. And
Yeah,
I always involve the parents. Um, I really do because especially if someone's trying to make some change, families are a system. So if the one person changes but then returns to a system that has not changed whatsoever, the likelihood of regressing into that pre-state before health and wellness and mindfulness and self-awareness kicked in is really high. So if we're talking about something like addiction, for example, you want to encourage the participation of the family, and it really is considered like a family. I don't like using the word disease, but it's a symptom of the family system.
sure.
So it would be remiss to not involve them.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. So this is random, but my wife works in pediatric ortho. So a kid jumps off a wall and he's 8 and he breaks his arm. That's who she goes to. And although she's really busy and her clinic is really busy, overall, the clinics have been down across the country for boys, meaning they're still
Mm,
seeing the same amount of patients, but boys are getting less and less injured as they were. They were, teenage boys were the riskiest of people, but now
right.
ortho clinics are just as likely to see a teenage girl or a 50-year-old man in there with a broken arm than a young boy. And I think it's because
Interesting.
I think it's because we've kind of sheltered them a little bit and they're inside and they're playing. What are your thoughts on that, if any?
I mean, that checks out,
Yeah.
right? If they're inside. My husband and I drove past a park that he used to go to as a kid that he would always say was like swarming with ants of kids, just it was so popular and there wasn't a single one there. And it felt like, wow, all these kids are inside.
Do you remember the
Uh,
tire park?
yes,
It's no
I do.
longer there. Like,
Really? Oh,
so the tire park was in a grammar school that Blair and I went to, and it was, a giant playground made of all different sorts of tires, from like monster truck tires to regular tires. But it was what one would consider now a dangerous playground because it was just
wow. I could
it,
almost smell it when you're
yeah,
describing it. I
you could
could
smell the
smell the
rubber. Yeah.
rubber.
So, but you don't see playgrounds like that anymore. All the playgrounds have
Yeah,
been reduced to these small little plastic safe playgrounds. Nothing is up too high. None of the slides are
right.
too
No more
big.
seesaws.
No more seesaws. And I,
Or
I
that
think,
spinny thing where like inevitably some kid was catapulted off of
yes, yeah, the spinny things, I mean, you're going to get hurt every day, but I do think you learn a lot of lessons,
yeah,
and these kids are going to get hurt, and like eventually, inevitably, you almost want it to happen younger so they learn a
right.
lesson. I don't think it's a good thing that
Yeah.
they're basically bubble wrapping our entire outdoor play.
I'm with you. I'm
Yeah.
with you. And I was talking to my family over the weekend, and my nephew, who is now 10, will be hours outside with his friends and on his bike, and they live in a safe neighborhood in New Jersey. And it's like he'll go and it's like I think it's on the hour he pops his head in and says like, hey, okay, I'm good. And he's running around again with the neighborhood kids. And I felt like like I was so happy to know that still exists. I would imagine there's a huge difference from urban kids versus suburban kids
Sure.
versus the country kids. And I really hope that that still goes on. It was nice to know. I haven't seen that. Like, I'm close to LA. I just haven't seen like the young ones out and about just in a group together. But yeah, I'm with you. I think there's a lot of great independence and adventure and body awareness and all that to come if you're outside playing that you're not going to get inside. And then what's interesting is like the parents of teenagers in a way kind of like it, because they like the teenagers are smoking less, drinking less, having less sex. So for the parents, they're like, oh, this is good. But like developmentally, it's like, okay, well, is it?
Yeah, I mean, when you said those three things, you don't do any of those three things alone. You certainly don't have sex alone.
Right.
You don't.
I know, now they're watching really intense porn, which is a whole nother
It's a
issue.
whole nother issue. But drinking and smoking and all these things, to me, it's like, yeah, maybe we did those things too young. Maybe we were 15 in the woods doing these things. I don't know how great that was, but for us physiologically anyway. But you were building camaraderie and friendships when you were doing these things. It's like, well, yeah, now you're not doing those things because those aren't solo activities. If you're just in your room,
Right.
typing to people away on your tablet, of course you're
Mhm.
not doing these things, but that doesn't mean it's healthier. It'd be much healthier for you to be running around the woods with 3 beers than it would be to sit inside your tablet and be depressed.
Right. I'd be really interested to see a study on incoming college freshman and sophomore year, like how they've changed as a result of this. Are they going, because I feel like there was that pattern of if you did it when you were 15, 16, 17, you had some beers and you had like that one night where you threw up. And by the time you got to college, you were kind of like geared up
Sure.
to not go balls to the wall.
Yeah,
That was definitely my experience.
totally. Yeah, I think
I
that's
feel like we noticed the really sheltered kids that went to college and kind of went like bonkers.
those were the kids you heard about like second week freshman year in the dorm, like the ambulance is pulling up because
Right.
they've never had liquor before and they drank a half a bottle of, Jack Daniels. Like, what are you doing? Well, I didn't know any better. It was my second time drinking. So
Right.
you wonder how often that's happening now, those sorts of things. It's like it's going to come for you eventually. The sooner the
Hmm.
better. And doing it, and obviously all moderation
Correct.
is always best. But yeah, it is interesting to see. I know in the workforce from my friends who own businesses, it's been tough to hire people
Mm,
because of what the expectations are for some kids who are coming out, right? Not only from like a financial perspective, but like a workload perspective and
yeah.
what they're supposed to say and not say. I think we just grew up in maybe a different generation where we looked up to older people and saw like a hierarchy of age. You're older than me,
Right.
I'm going to listen to you, and it doesn't necessarily happen anymore.
Right. And I feel like we could talk for hours and even days on this topic. And just recently I was with a friend of mine who's a TV producer who like me actually was having her kid during COVID. And we were so grateful that like, wow, this is kind of a nice silver lining that now as mothers, work is so much more accessible and flexible that we can work from home.
Hmm.
That's her story as well. And then she's like, but you know what, Blair, she had a younger girl, she's probably, I don't know, late 20s or so, who's never worked in an office. She's been a full-time employee since she began her work career, and has never worked in an office.
Mm.
And I thought like, wow, that feels really unfortunate. Like the opportunity, like you're saying, to have a mentor or just the indirect learning that happens just from being in an environment like that.
Yeah,
And I felt sad for that.
me
I felt
too.
sad for that person.
I tell young personal trainers all the time, there was no more central important thing to my career than being in a gym, learning from others who knew so much more than me, older
Yes.
trainers, and just taking their knowledge. Now, a lot of things they said, I threw out. I didn't like what they said.
Mhm.
Maybe it was bunk, but I learned under 5 or 6 different people, and I took a little bit from all of them that helped me develop into the person I am. And unless you're
Yes.
there physically learning from people like on the floor and seeing things, you're never going
Yep.
to develop, because what I say is you never want to be the smartest person in the room. And
Right.
if you do everything on Zoom, right, you're always the smartest person in the room because it's you, the expert, and then the other person who's trying to get some information from you.
Correct. It's so much implied there. And you think about like those years when you start a new career and you're such a sponge and you don't have a family yet and you can just really give it your all. It's unfortunate that their experiences aren't as rich as they could be.
Yeah. And I don't blame them for not trying to then kind of backtrack. If you've built your career virtually, whether in any industry, right? Whether it was your like
Mhm.
your friend's 20-year-old kid or personal trainer or whatever, and you're like, well, I'm doing this now. It works for me. My life is
Mhm.
easy. Like, why would I make my life
Mhm.
harder? Why would I go seek out driving 25 minutes to the local gym and trying to apply? Like, I get it. But I do feel
Yeah,
like there is a knowledge base that is lost there that is I'm glad I had it that way. I'm glad I had to
same.
go door to door and be, I'm sure you too in a clinical setting, like be
Oh
there
yeah.
watching what was going on.
So much so actually when I first started doing Zoom sessions, I wanted to reduce my rate and I felt like I was giving people a bunk deal. And
Yeah,
it required me to seek my own therapy via Zoom and feel that it's effective
yeah.
to like get behind it.
Interesting. Yeah, I had the same problem. I I actually do charge less. I charge less virtual personal training, but I was charging much less than I was.
Mhm.
And even it wasn't the charge less point that hurt like me right away. It was the fact that I didn't even want to reach out to my past clients and let them know that I was available virtually because what
Mhm.
I had been able to give them on site in my mind was just this was so much less of a product,
Yeah,
right? I'm giving you so much less quality of a product, but it's not about me, it's about them. And if they preferred to use me virtually rather than use someone else live, then that's what they prefer.
that's
So
right.
I had
You
to like
nailed it.
I had to like swallow my ego and be like, yeah, maybe I'm not 100%, but maybe my 80% suits their personality better than someone else's live 100%.
Right. Year after year, telehealth is reported with greater efficacy from clients than it is from providers. And at the end of the day, it's about the client. So exactly.
Well, I wonder too, both in your industry and my industry, there are two. Well, I would say my industry, it's maybe even more. You could tell me otherwise, but comfortability is really important.
Mhm.
Obviously someone's going to feel more comfortable at home in most instances than they are in public. But in my case, at least in your case, you're still one on one. It's not like there's
Yeah.
random people in a hallway, right? Whether you're in your office or whether you're doing it virtually. But in my
Right.
case, I could be in a gym and this person could be working out in front of 50 or 60 other people and feel embarrassed. Now they're in front of just me and them in their own home. So they
Mhm.
don't have to worry about that added kind of pressure to it.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And if it gives greater access to parents, to professionals, to anyone who's even like a little on the fence about it and all the other barriers that could have been the traffic or the needing to get dressed and up and out and yada yada, particularly with some diagnoses like agoraphobia, for example. This is the thing, right? That's someone who really has a fear of leaving their home.
Mm.
So we can totally spin it to such a positive, but it feels different.
Speaking of the crossovers between my industry and yours, I spent a lot of time on my podcast talking about how there's a very low barrier to entry in personal training. So you have to watch out. The cream rises to the top, but one personal trainer is not the same as the next. The
Mm,
certifications are really easy to get. So for me,
yes.
the most important thing is like how many hours you've spent and how successful you are with clients.
Mhm.
Explain your industry, all the terminology, the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist and a counselor and all these different people and what the barriers to entry are and why we should maybe be concerned with that if we do have some sort of mental health problem and who we're seeing and who we're talking to.
Sure. I would say looking for someone with a license is a great first step. And that could be licensed with a master's. So you can have a MSW, Master's in Social Work, a licensed MFT, which is Marriage and Family Therapy. There's an LCPP, licensed clinical practitioner. Anyway, look for the license because if someone is licensed, so that's the master's level, then you can go to the doctoral level, which is clinical psychologists. Um, but if you have a license, you've needed certain amount of hours. You have to abide by law and ethics. You've taken exams just to display some knowledge base. And granted, these things don't make someone a good therapist per se,
Yeah.
but if someone's seeking therapy, I would certainly look for the license. You can have someone, I was working with someone as just collaborating with someone who was an executive functioning coach. I don't know what she had to do to get there, and her rate was higher than mine. And I remember feeling salty about that. I was like, wait a second, what do your student loans look like versus mine? But if they're in the life coach, anything that's coach, mental health coach, let that be a trigger word,
Yeah.
or
What
just
about
a bit of
counselor?
a red flag. Yeah. So there's great like drug and alcohol counselors, for example. Usually counselors have a bachelor's degree. If you are licensed, if you have like a number from a state, so within the states, like I know California has a KDAC, so I think that's a California Drug and Alcohol, and you could do it online per se, but you still have a certain amount of hours, and you're gonna see a number. That's definitely someone who has earned the credibility to see someone in a clinical setting.
Yeah. It's not easy. It's not easy to sift through. I mean, it doesn't matter what
Mhm.
industry you're in, counseling, rehabilitation, personal training, accountant, garbage man. There are good
Mhm.
people and there are bad people. I don't mean like bad as in
Right.
like not great, like they're trying to get you, but people who are good at their jobs and people who maybe care less and are not as good at their jobs. So,
Yeah, and have
yeah.
different strengths. Like, working even at treatment centers. So I work at both Carrera Treatment Wellness and Spa and PH Wellness, which is out in Riverside. We advocate for our clients through the documentation. So in other words, particularly at PH, most of the clients are insurance based. So
Mm,
the way that we're going to ensure the most amount of time and the more the better is through great documentation. Okay, so that's how we're going to fight the good fight. You can have someone who's an amazing therapist and does not document well, and it really is not great. Like it's not an effective, it's not the whole person professional that we're looking for. You can inversely have someone who's great behind the computer but doesn't connect well,
mm.
and that person also won't be the one we offer the job to. So you need a bit of well-roundedness.
Yeah, it's not easy. Especially,
Mhm.
well, I wonder, this is just randomly that came off the top of my head. Are you allowed to have like AI or listening tools in therapy so that you don't have to write notes and you can write notes afterwards? Like, can you record sessions and then listen to them afterwards?
I'm sure you could
Yeah.
with permission,
Yeah.
but really if you're going for insurance and you're at a treatment center, it's not necessarily the content of the session. You're really doing it's medical necessity. So at
Gotcha.
that point, you're assessing for, sleep and tremors and vitals and all of that sort of thing. It has more of a medical component to it. And even in my private practice, when I document a note, that's more of like a subjective and objective and content and plan. But I would never be doing that during a session. And then I would never want to miss this opportunity
Do
to
you
look
take
at
any
someone.
notes during a session?
Never.
And then the second they leave, you just jot down the things that were important to, like you said, for the medical sake. If you're like, okay, I believe this person might need to stay on X, Y, and Z medication during this time for the next 10 days or something.
Sure. And as a psychologist, this is another great thing to highlight. As a psychologist, I don't prescribe medications, nor
Mhm.
do I do medication management per se. But if I do need that, if a patient needs that, I will incorporate a psychiatrist onto the team.
Mhm.
And communication amongst providers is so important.
Yeah.
I believe we talked about this in our first podcast that we did together.
Yeah.
Like imagine a world where like even as the personal trainer and the psychologist and all of us can work together and seeing someone as the whole person.
Yeah. I was able to do that in a small community that I was in. I had connections with the ortho people. I had connections with the physical therapy people who were locally, and I couldn't talk to their GPs all the time, but if there was an issue from like a structural standpoint, right? The client that
Mhm.
gets surgery, they were getting a knee replacement, they were getting a disc replacement, something was going on. I was able to talk to the ortho, see what was going on, then talk to physical therapy, and then come to me. And we had a really good sort of three-way communication to make
I
sure that
love that.
I was continuing the proper exercises and not doing anything to harm them. And they knew what I was doing. So that was good.
So comprehensive,
Yeah.
really. And not to mention like labs. I would imagine for you to be able to see labs. I feel like the nutritionist that I was on a panel with recently, they were all about the labs, and it really motivated me to want to get my labs checked.
Yeah, I at one point, I don't do it anymore, but at one point I made it mandatory for my clientele to give me their lab work if their goal was weight loss, because I said
Mm,
if there are other things here hindering our goal, then we're spending too much time fighting the other components, if that makes sense, right? So if you have some
sure.
physiological barriers that need to be handled with doctors above my pay grade, then we're just running in circles here and you're paying me for no reason. So like let me look at your lab work, and then if your GP approves you and if there's nothing glaring here, you don't have to go see an endocrinologist or something, then we'll move forward. And
Makes so much sense.
yeah, and I think it's tough because it's not something that we're taught as personal trainers. You have to go above and beyond to learn that and take that in,
Mhm,
and then there's the problem with like, well, is that above my pay grade? Kind of, but
mm,
then don't work with me because
right,
I'm trying to do you a service. I'm not leading you in the wrong direction.
right, right. I
Uh,
would hope that people would wanna do whatever it takes, whatever it's in their power and in their scope to help
yeah, yeah. The labs are
independent
great
healthy
too for
professionals.
people. People think that lab work needs to be compared to other people's lab work. Everything's sort of in a spectrum or ratio, and we're all different, right? We talked about this. We're all
Mhm,
very biodiverse and psychodiverse. The lab work is important to compare to yourself over time. So I compare my lab work not to whatever the range is necessarily. Of course, you want to be within certain ranges, but what does Steve's lab work look like at 38 as compared to 28? And what will it look like at 48? Because if
mhm,
something is really off between 48 and 38, that tells me, okay, what, like maybe this is a red flag. Something has
mhm,
changed drastically. Even if I'm still within the ranges
mhm.
of what is supposed to be healthy, my body has changed. So now do I need to be worried about that? And I think that's what people overlook.
Yeah, makes sense.
So another parenting question here. This is just purely anecdotal. I'm going to have a second
Yeah,
kid down the road at some point. I don't know when, but when that second
yeah.
kid pops up, what are things that you saw after the fact that are important for parents who are having a second kid being introduced into the family?
Oh, that's a complicated time. So my older daughter, Naomi, who'll be 6 in June, is a deeply feeling child. She's sensitive and she is so connected to me, and I love that. And having a little sister, it wasn't the first month because newborns really sleep so much. We kind of forget how sleepy they are. Um, and she was like a little doll. But once little sister started waking up, Naomi certainly kind of got into that attention by any means necessary
Mm,
and would even talk like a baby. She saw that babies get a lot of attention, and this baby talk went on for 3 years.
wow.
Not out of the home, but in the home. Like it's really just getting better now.
Yeah.
Um so I think people were, children will react differently. I don't know if it's like if they're the same gender versus different gender, if that impacts things. It's hard on the marriage. I will say that.
Yeah.
Like it's the name of the game of divide and conquer becomes so ever present. It certainly was in my household. So, which had a lot of pros. My younger daughter was more and is more attached to her dad than my older one was.
Yeah.
There were so many variables within that. So that's fantastic. Um, it's really complicated, but my husband and I would split, so the younger one would go with to him more, and I would do my one-on-one with Naomi to give her the reassurance and that I think she really needed, that mom is still here for her and for whatever she needs. But that kind of made parenting a little lonely for me, to be honest, because it was this we were dividing and conquering a lot.
Yeah.
So things were tricky and challenging in the early, like in the first year of little sister being around. So when we were all in the same room, it felt a little intense. I mean, of
Yeah.
course we would be at times, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's hard. It's
Yeah.
hard. I mean, talk about systems. You add another person in and it changes so much.
Yeah. Not to mention, the term divide and conquer. I mean, it makes perfect sense. And I get what you're saying. But when people hear that, sometimes they feel like that is like something you would use in the workplace, right?
Mhm.
So you're like, oh, divide and conquer. It's like, yeah, so I'm doing this task, you're doing this task. But like you said, ultimately it's like, well, there's a bigger macro thing here where like we're raising a family. So yes, we can
Yeah.
divide and conquer these things, but like do like when do we slow down and like have the family time? And that is certainly like my first concern is just like, hey, if I'm already like booked out on time, if we're already as busy as we can be, and we like introduce
Mhm.
a new kid into the family, how do we make sure that it doesn't feel task oriented and it feels like, we're just, raising a family, and
Right.
not
It
easy.
sucks, and sometimes it does feel like we're running a business. We're running a house. We've got to do inventory, right? We've got to do so much.
Yeah.
And we both are professionals, so that adds to it. Um, there are a lot of great tips that you can get for like introducing big sister. Well, in your case, you have Mackenzie as a girl. So for Steve's case, is big sister, but could be big brother to the new baby, like introducing them in a neutral setting, like in the car seat or whatever, like rather than in the parents' arms.
Hmm.
Um, you can give a little something from the baby to the older sibling. There are a lot of cute and what seemingly effective things like for those really early days. But again, for me, didn't start hard. It just got hard.
Yeah. My daughter is very nurturing and caring. That's all she does is like take care of babies and like fake animals and take care of me and like tries to put me to sleep and all
Sweet.
that. She's almost 3. So I think, if and when there's a new baby, I would probably try to introduce like her as like being helpful, rather
Yeah,
than like
that's a great way to do it.
yeah, like we need your help in this process, like as much as
Right.
she could understand that. I think that might be more uh
Yes, have her
and
participate. She'll feel great about that.
yeah. And that might not work for everybody, but that's just
We
my
tried
thought.
it and we did it, and she loved that. And
Yeah.
still there was still more to it. Um, Also not using like the baby as a reason why you can't do something. Like let's say mom's nursing the baby and it's like, oh, I can't do that because I have to nurse the baby. You can rephrase and reframe a lot of things to not make it that you can't do something because of the baby. I think that could breed a
You
little
mean
bit
to
of
your kid, not to
resentment
everyone
there
else,
to the
not to everyone
child,
else.
right?
Yeah.
To the,
Because I
right.
still want to use my kids as an excuse not to go
Yeah,
out or
use
not to
that.
not to see people. Yeah.
Yeah, you get that one for a long time.
Yeah.
But right, so the older sib.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I wouldn't think of that. I think I've also had conversations before as my kid gets older, we're not going to talk about I mean, we'll talk about exercise as like a healthy thing we like to do. Like, my daughter knows
Mhm,
like sometimes she's like, where's daddy or where's mommy? They're at the gym, and we like try to explain
mhm.
what the gym is, but we're never going to talk about weight, or
No,
like
yeah,
a husband wife might say to each other like, oh, I'm just like feeling like lately, like my body, like these are normal conversations, so there's nothing wrong with saying that to your significant other in private when the doors closed at 8:30 at night. But that's not
right.
something that I feel we will never say that in front of our kids at dinner
I'm
table.
so big on that one. I'm
Yeah.
so big on that. I think it's as early as like 2.5 that little girls start becoming body conscious. And
Yeah.
that's directly connected to the way the parents speak about their own bodies or even criticize others. Like if there's a theme of like, ew, look at that person, they're fat or whatever, they'll start associating someone's worth around their weight. And that could be a really slippery slope.
Yeah, I think we might have touched on the food conversation last time, or at least, I've had it before, and maybe we talked about it privately,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't restrict what my daughter eats. Some
Mm-mm.
parents do. Everyone has different ways in which they go about it. I just try not to overthink it. Like I have
Same.
majority of healthy foods in my house. I
Yep.
also have regular snacks and some kid stuff, and whatever she
Yep.
wants in most instances, I give it to her because I feel like
Yeah.
if I fight it, then she wants that thing even more and it doesn't work out.
I'm with you. I'm with you. I mean,
Yeah.
even if you think about like, we can use like foreign countries and drinking ages. Those
Mhm.
kids, versus American kids that are told they can't and shouldn't do it till they're 21 have very different habits around it.
Yeah, we don't even have to go that far. The town next to us, which had more money than us from like a, median standpoint, we were maybe lower middle class, they were middle to upper. A
Hmm.
lot of their parents allowed them to drink at a younger age, 15, 16, 17. And I noticed that they didn't even want to. They didn't want to have
Hmm.
parties. They didn't want to do stuff. Whereas
Hmm.
in we were fighting to get into the woods and sneaking out of our house and doing stuff
Yep.
because it was so like our parents were just more strict on that. And I feel like it does make a difference.
It does. It does. Yeah. I would never want to give food too much energy, right? Like
Yeah.
of the do's and the don'ts, especially when they're little, or even like ever.
Yeah.
Really, truly, you could see it be passed down, even if a parent is dieting. And so you could say you have zero restrictions around your child, but let's say the parent is super like measuring this out and doing this and kind of meticulous and pushing around the plate. What we do speaks so loudly,
Yeah.
maybe even more so than what we say. So we have to be really careful of what things we want to pass down. And they are always, always watching and listening. They really are. They're always watching, that's for sure. I mean,
Well,
just recently, unfortunately, we have a family member in the hospital, and finally, over the weekend, I sat the girls down to tell them about it. And Naomi was like, "Yeah, I know. I heard you on the phone." And I was
mm,
like, "Oh, snap."
yeah,
Right. So you really have to
yeah, they're
watch.
I mean, just think about us. We knew everything that was going on, right? I don't like
Yep.
there was never a Christmas present in my house. I didn't know where it was.
Oh my
Right.
goodness. Yep. We every year was like dad's work party, and that's when we'd like get the flashlights and go in the attic and
Yeah.
completely ruin Christmas, but it was the best.
And yet we can't wrap our heads around the fact that like our kids are likely going to be smarter than us too. It's like, or they're going to figure things out because
Yeah.
it's just
Hmm.
that's just the natural human experiences. But like, they like, we think that, we're going to outsmart everyone else. It's like, no, that's not how it happens.
I know.
The
They're
next
coming out the
generation
gate
always gets
hot.
you. Well, what I will
That's
say
right.
is, I'm far from the perfect parent, and my biggest problem now is I am very overly protective of my daughter physically to the point where
Okay.
like she is definitely like behind in like the adventure kind of thing, right? My daughter is like, if you look at like just the metrics of like figuring out puzzles, she's like a year and a half, 2 years ahead of like what she should be, right? But
Awesome.
if you look at like climbing stuff, she's well behind, like probably almost a year behind what she should be doing. And part of it's just because like dad is her shadow, basically, like she can't get hurt. And it's something that I need to work on. I need to let her do that. But it's harder as a dad to watch your daughter get injured.
Okay, yeah, I could see that, right? So if we can instill some fear and anxiety, I know I have that around pools, like,
Mhm.
and I instilled such a fear around my 3-year-old with swimming and not even going near the pool if she doesn't have her floaties on, that now she won't take her floaties off to do a swim lesson.
Mm.
So now I can't even teach her how to swim without them
She's a
because
rule
she won't go
follower.
in her pool
Yeah.
without her swimmies. And like I'm kind of good with that to be honest for now
Yeah.
because it really like it's just one of my things. Um but yeah.
Yeah, you created a rule follower. I have the same thing with the street. If my daughter goes like within 20
Yep.
yards of a street, she just runs to me and says, "Pick me up." Like she won't go
Yeah.
anywhere near the street. I'm like, "Well, good."
Right.
Like, we'll learn how to cross the street later on. If you want to run to me and you're nervous of the street, that's a good thing.
Yeah. And also just I've observed this. I don't know if there's real data behind it. There very well could be, but I've observed it in kids and toddlers. They seem to pick one, whether it's the fine motor, like the puzzles that you were talking about, or the
Mhm.
gross motor, which would
Mhm.
be the jumping. They seem to fine tune one first. Like my older daughter didn't even walk. I didn't even, she was like, she didn't walk, but she could speak in full sentences when she was this little, like, little blob on the floor.
Same, same.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, and her sister, who's just more physical, was seemed less advanced verbally, but then they're both kind of catching up on both realms. So I think there's something to that.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense if you try to like kind of extrapolate why. If you're immediately find yourself being strong and you have the ability to explore, you're almost using that as like your biofeedback to learn things. It's right.
Yeah,
Like I'm able to climb this and see how sturdy this is. Like you're using your body to learn how space is. And vice
right.
versa. If you don't feel like you're that strong, but you have good fine motor skills and you're able to talk, you're able to use
Hmm.
that to sort of that's what they're trying to do, right? Learn how things are going on. So they're just
Right.
playing to their strengths, which
Yeah.
inevitably pushes the other skill set back.
And birth order. Firstborn is around adults who are talking and doing things and cooking, and that's what they're looking at. So maybe they want to talk more. And the younger sibling, I remember Olivia being like a week old. She was like a little pea head in her car seat, and it was like, well, we're going to the park today because we had a 3-year-old, and that's what we were doing. And it was COVID, right? So, but we were still like, buckle up, Buttercup. Like this is what we're up to. So she's seen a jungle gym since like out the gate. Whereas I don't know if we would have gone to a park, especially like that with Naomi. So
Sure.
just their experiences over the weekend. There's this like funny boom right now in the girls' community at their Montessori school of sisters having baby sisters, and we had like double birthday parties this weekend, and there they were, these babies days old at the toddler birthday parties, just in the mix of things. So I would imagine that impacts it too.
Blair, this has been a fantastic conversation. Let my listeners know where they can find more about you, whether that's reaching out to you directly for any services or just following you and your journey.
Yes, you can follow me at Dr. Blair Syd. That's DrBlairPsyd on Instagram. Also the same on my website, and I have a contact form there. Should you want to reach out, I will get back to you within 24 hours. So that's www.drblairsid.com.
I'll list all that in the details in the show notes.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Blair, thank you so much for joining.
So good to see you as always. Thank you for having me.
You too.
Till next time.